Okay, today we will be talking about writing equations in slope-intercept form. That is 8.2b, write linear equations in two variables in various forms, including y equals mx plus b, ax plus by equals c, and y minus y sub 1 equals m times x minus x sub 1, given 1 point and the slope, and given 2 points. And also 8.2c, write linear equations in two variables, given a table of values, a graph, and a verbal description. And since we're only dealing with slope-intercept form, we have marked out the standard form and point-slope form. Our objectives today: students will write equations in slope-intercept form given the point and a slope, and students will write equations in slope-intercept form given 2 points. Okay, so as a reminder, slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, and let's remember that the m and the b are the slope and the y-intercept, m being slope and y being y-intercept. And then that leaves the x and the y. The x and y make up a point that is on the line represented by that equation. So when you are writing equations in slope-intercept form, given certain information, you want to always ask yourself, what information am I given? So let's say you're given a point and a slope. If you're given the point and the slope and you need to write an equation in slope-intercept form, you want to first find the y-intercept, b, and then you'll be able to write the equation in slope-intercept form. So let's look at that. Let's say we are given the point 4, 1 and a slope of 2. Well, the information that I'm given would be a point 4, 1 and the slope 2. So in order to write it in slope-intercept form, we want to start by writing our formula, y equals mx plus b, and then we're simply going to substitute the information in for the variables that are known. So we know that x is 4 based on the point. We know that y is 1 and m is 2. So we're going to substitute that in so that we can solve for b. When we do that, we put in the 1 for y, the 2 for the slope, and 4 for x. And we simplify and find that b is equal to negative 7. Once we know what b is, remember when we put things in slope-intercept form, the only variables we substitute for are for m and b, so we get the equation y equals 2x minus 7. Let's look at this next example here, this graph. If you look at it, they have a point marked for us, and since it's a graph, we could figure out the slope. So we are essentially given a point and the slope. So in order to find the slope, we could do rise over run. When we do that, we find that the slope is negative 5 because we go 5 units up, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 1 unit to the left. So that makes this a negative sloping line, and the slope is negative 5, and then the point that we have here is negative 1, negative 2. So in order to put this into slope-intercept form, again, there's our formula, y equals mx plus b, and we're going to substitute in what we know, y, which is negative 2, negative 5 for m, and negative 1 for x, so that we can solve for b. And when we do that and simplify, we find that, again, b is negative 7, and our equation for this graph is y equals negative 5x minus 7. Again, substituting in the m and the b for our equation. For our next example, we have a verbal description. At the Kima Boardwalk, you can rent a canoe for $10 an hour. You and your friends rented a canoe for 3 hours and paid $45. Write an equation in slope-intercept form that can be used to find the total cost for renting a canoe. So here we want to look at the information from here. And what we notice is that we have this $10 an hour. That's a rate. And so again, remember, a rate represents a slope. So that means the slope is 10. And then we have 3 hours for $45. The $45 depends on the number of hours, in this case 3, so that means that 3 represents X and 45 represents Y, because the money is dependent on the hours. So we can set up a point using the 3 and the 45, and we know that the slope is 10. Again, we know a point and the slope, so we're going to substitute that into our formula. And once we simplify, we will find that B is equal to 15, and we substitute into our slope-intercept form M, which is 10 in this case, and 15, which we found for B. Alright, let's say we have something just a little bit different. Again, a reminder that this is our slope-intercept form, that M stands for the slope, B is the y-intercept, and X and Y represent a point on that line. Let's say the information that we're given is 2 points. If you're given 2 points, you want to, 1, find the slope, and next, find the y-intercept. Again, you're going to substitute those into the slope-intercept form for the final equation. And that way, we can do step 3, write the equation in slope-intercept form. So let's look at this example. We have the point -12, -1, and another point, -3, -4. So here, our information that we're given, we have 2 points. If we want to write this equation in slope-intercept form, we have to first find the slope. And so we can find the slope of a line given 2 points by substituting our information. This represents the second point, -3, -4, and this represents the first point, -12, -1. And remember that the slope is the change in the y values over the change in the x values. And so here you'll notice that we have this double negative. Just like in English, we cannot have double negatives in math, honey. So we have got to do something about that. Remember that minus means to add the opposite. So once we simplify that, we'll have -4 plus 1 for our numerator and -3 plus 12 for our denominator. And once we simplify, we get -3 over 9, which can be simplified finally for a slope of -1/3. So now we have the slope, and we can choose either point to substitute in to find the y-intercept. So here's our formula. We are going to substitute in for the point -12, -1 for the x and the y values. And once we simplify everything, we find that B is -5. And so our equation for the line that contains those 2 points is y equals -1/3 x minus 5. Okay, let's say we have this table. Eli is using a rowing machine. The table shows how many calories he can burn for the lengths of time. So the information that we're given would be 2 points. So since we have a table, and a table is just a collection of points, we can choose any 2 points we want in order to find the slope. So let's say we chose 2:24 and 4:48. The time value being x and the calories being the y, because the number of calories burned depending on the time. So we're going to substitute in the information into our slope of a line given 2 points formula so that we can find the slope. And once we simplify the information, we find that the slope is 6. Now that we know the slope, we're going to need to find the y-intercept. So here's our formula. We're going to choose the point 2:24, and once we simplify, we find that B is equal to 12. Now that we know the slope and the y-intercept, we're going to substitute it into our slope-intercept form, and we have the equation y equals 6x plus 12. Alright, now let's look at this graph. You'll notice that we have 2 points here on the graph, but we could also use those 2 points to help us find the slope. So In a way, you could find this in we can find the equation for this graph two ways. We could either look at it as having a point in the slope, or we could say that we have 2 points. So let's say that we have these 2 points, which are here on the graph, -2, -1, and 1, 1. We could find the slope by doing rise over run. And remember, rise shows the information moving up or down, and run talks about going left and right. To get from from this point to this point, we rise 2, we go up 2, which is a positive movement, and to the right 3, which is also a positive movement. So we have a positive slope of 2/3. We could also find the slope by using our slope of a line formula and substituting in the information, and notice that we also get 2/3 for the slope. Now that we know the slope, we're going to choose a point and substitute that in order to find the y-intercept. So we're going to use the point 1, 1 because that's easier to use. And once we simplify the information, we find that b is 1/3. Notice here that we have fractions. Please don't be afraid of fractions. Because we're going to be subtracting this 2/3, we had to choose a fractional representation for 1, and 3/3 is that fractional representation because we have to have common denominators to subtract. And that means our y-intercept is 1/3, and once we substitute in the slope and the y-intercept, we get for our equation y equals 2/3 x plus 1/3. Alright, and finally we have another verbal representation. The value of a car decreases at a constant rate. After 3 years, the value of the car is $15,000. After 2 more years, the value of the car is $11,000. Write in an equation, sorry, little typo there, write an equation in slope-intercept form that can be used to find the value of the car after any number of years. So what you'll notice here is that if we have 3 along with the 15,000, that represents 1 point. And then 2 more years, so that means 2 years after the 3, so 5 years, the value of the car is $11,000. So we have 2 points, whereas where the money is dependent on the number of years. So we can write our our points like this. So we have 3 and 15,000, 5 and 11,000. We can find the slope using our slope of a line equation. And once we simplify, we find that the slope is a -2,000. Again, notice it said that the slope is decreasing. That means it should be a negative slope. We're going to now substitute that slope in and choose a point so that we can solve for the y-intercept. And once we simplify, we find the y-intercept is 1,000, and the equation we can use is y equals -2,000x plus 1,000.